this video, we're going to have a look at dry fly fishing. Now, Stocks Reservoir lends itself really well to dries, and that's because rather than being really aquatically rich, it's the rough, marginal farmland that surrounds the reservoir that's really rich in terrestrial insects. There's a whole plethora of different beetle species, there's daddy longlegs, there's dung flies, there's all sorts of terrestrial insects that once they leave the protection of the undergrowth can get blown onto the surface of the water where they become quarry to trout. And because of that, we often fish our dries at the top of the wind. We'll often head up and find that slack water where the wind is coming off the shoreline and fish our dries there, because there's a buildup of trout there waiting for these insects falling from the immediate farmland. So let's have a look at the sort of leader setup that we'd use for dries. Now, there's lots of different ways of setting up a leader for dries, but this is one that works well on stocks and it's pretty easy to do. The first thing that becomes apparent is that you can see it's only 12 feet long and there's only 4 foot to your fly line and then 4 foot between both all your droppers. So there's 8 feet from your top dropper to your point fly. And the reason that we fish a shorter leader with less space between our flies is because we're using this leader to target rising fish. And if when a fish rises, it goes back down again, you've got some idea of where it's going, then you can land a fly in front of that fish will often come straight back up and take your fly with confidence. And by having your flies a little bit closer together than you usually would, the chances that one of them will land in its path are increased, rather than it being able to go straight through the gap between two flies because it can't see them because they're just too spaced out apart. So let's have a look at the sort of flies that we might use here on stocks. On the top dropper, I've got here one of my favourites. This little fly is called a half hog. Okay, now I use lots of other flies on my top dropper, but this one is a favourite of mine. It's a black and silver half hog. I like to use a floatant just to float on the top of the fly there, just to put a bit on the top, and I don't put any dressing underneath so that this beds in to the film. It doesn't sit proud floating like a cork. Instead, it sits in the film with the back end of the fly just subsurface. On the middle dropper here, I've got a red bits. Now, that could be a black bits, it could be a hopper, it could be a claret bits. Just a small, innocuous little dry like that. Once again, I like to put a bit of floatant just on the top half of the fly, allowing the second half of the fly to bed into that surface film and be anchored there. And finally, on the point here, I've got the foam daddy. The foam daddy takes some beating on stocks. Fish seem to love them. And one little trick here, which is a definite tip, is I don't gink these daddy long legs up. I find them much more effective when they're really sat in the film or even just subsurface, and the fish will take them with confidence. Now, there's another reason for having your flies bedded in to that surface film rather than floating like corks on top, and that is because when a fish comes up to take your fly, a very, very buoyant fly can be pushed out of the way and the fish can miss your fly. Whereas one that's stuck and anchored in that surface film, the fish can come up and close its mouth around it without pushing it out of the way, and you get a much more positive take and a much better hookup rate. One other thing that might surprise you is that my choice of leader material is fluorocarbon, as is most people that fish in the competition circuit and everything. They fish fluorocarbon with dries. Now that might surprise you, but you can spend a long time using Fuller's Earth or a leader sink like this one to degrease a copolymer leader to try and get them to sit subsurface when fluorocarbon will just cut through that surface film and sit under the water that much quicker. And the way we're going to fish these things is it means that the flies won't have time to sink anyway. You'll see that a bit later on. Now, a lot of people say to me, I haven't seen any fish rising, why would you fish dries? And that's one of the biggest myths out there. Even though there aren't fish rising at any given day, dries can still be the most effective way of catching fish. I remember John Horsey telling me a story when he'd just come off the reservoir down there at Chew Valley, and he'd won the competition with 8 fish on a really tricky day. And another competitor came over to him and said, God, John, well done, mate. How did you catch those? And John went, oh, dries mainly. I caught them all on dries. And he went, really? Dries? I haven't seen a fish rise all day. And John just said, no, I've only seen 8. And that's the 8 that have come up and taken his flies, not 8 fish that he'd seen and covered. So it just goes to show, even when they're not rising, it's a fantastic way and very efficient way of catching fish. So let's take this leader out onto the water and see what we can do with it. Dry fly fishing is actually a relatively simple way of fly fishing, but there are a few simple mistakes that are commonly made, and one of them is this: throwing a great long line to Timbuktu. We all like casting a nice line, but when you're fishing dries, it isn't the time. If a fish takes my fly right out there, my chances of hooking it and successfully landing it are greatly diminished. Also, if a fish rises close by that I now want to cover with my leader, then I've got to quickly strip all this line in because I can't pick up that length of line off the water. I've then got to lift up and try and get round and cover a rising fish that's now gone into the next county. So when we fish dries, we fish on a short line, just enough line that you can comfortably lift off the water and replace. I have this extra line down here on the floor of the boat, just in case a fish rises a little bit further away and I can shoot some line to cover it quickly. Now, if I see a fish rising in the distance, I'll generally ignore it if I feel like it's coming my way. Because of that reason, much better chance of hooking it and catching it. Just missed one. Looking at you and not at this. So, however, if I feel like it's going away from me and I'm not going to catch up to it on the drift, I may well then risk a slightly longer chuck. But patience is definitely the virtue when it comes to dry fly fishing. Now, the most likely time you're going to get a fish come up and take your dries are within the first 3 seconds of your flies landing on the water. So rather than put the dries out there and leave them floating forever and a day, we tend to cast regularly at maybe 10-second intervals, something like that, between 5 and 10 seconds. There we go. One of the key skills when fishing dries is changing direction quickly and accurately. And one of the simplest ways of doing that is simply to swing the rod to where you want to cast, in front of where you've seen the fish. Just lift off up to your head and down again in that direction. The line will swing round in the sky to become in line with where you want to cast and land hopefully in front of your fish. You lift off, that's the key. Swing the line, cast up and drop it down and you'll come in line. It's a lot quicker than picking a line up and trying to work your way round like so. So the fish is over there, I lift off, I try and get in front of the fish. I'm just pausing because there was actually a fish just a bit further away from me there. And then drop the line down again. Simple, fast and effective. Dry fly fishing is a really effective way of catching a quick bag of fish, and there's nowhere better to do it than here on Stocks Reservoir. Now, There's lots of other variations to the way I've shown today, different leader setups, different dries, but the general principle remains the same. A short line, cast regularly, and keep your eye out for that rising fish. Come and give it a go.